How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Zayin, Daf 7 of Masechta Horayos. Daf 7, we begin the second parak of Masechta Horayos. We will be discussing the primary topic of today's daf is going to be the kohen moshiach. The kohen moshiach. That is, the first part of today's daf is I'm going to do a shtickle explainer of the kohen moshiach and the sa'ir nasi. Okay? The first parak of Masechta Horayos, we were focused on the elam davar shel tzibur, and now we're going to focus a bit more on the kohen moshiach and sa'ir nasi. So we'll start with a brief explainer of those two types of korbanis, and then we are going to spend the daf itself focused primarily on the kohen moshiach, defining where it applies, when it's offered. We're going to discuss the relationship between the kohen moshiach and the elam davar shel tzibur. When the kohen moshiach applies, okay, there's going to be a lot of repeating themes in some ways throughout today's daf. Yeah, we're basically going to define where the kohen moshiach applies, what it is, where it applies, and kind of massaging that in some ways throughout the daf, I'd say. So, Chaver, let us begin the second parak of Masechta Horayos. Okay. So I want to start today's daf with a brief explainer of a sa'ir nasi and the kohen moshiach. We touched on it briefly in the introduction to Masechta Horayos Bichlal, in the general introduction a week ago to Masechta Horayos. But let's take another look. Let's refresh ourselves. Let's talk about briefly these two korbanos. Let's start with the sa'ir nasi first, because it's the more straightforward one. Now, normally if a person sins by accident, use our classic example of chaylev, person thought that they were eating shuman, but in fact they ate chaylev, and they were informed after the fact, and they said, dope. So they bring a korban chatas. They ate chaylev by accident. It's something that you chayiv. If you ate it deliberately, you'd be chayiv kares. You ate it by accident, you bring a korban chatas. Now that's either a she-goat or a she-sheep. Okay. Now, if you are the king, the nasi, the king, well then you don't bring a she-goat or a she-sheep. You have your own unique korban. Your korban as the king is a he-goat. A he-goat. That's the korban of the king, and that's the sa'ir nasi. That's the sa'ir nasi. And that's all there is to it, really. It's literally the same thing as a korban chatas, just that if you're the king, instead of it being a se'ira or a kisba, it is a sa'ir, it is a goat. That's all. That's the sa'ir nasi. It's the unique korban chatas, so to speak, of a king. The korban moshiach is, I guess you would say, like the korban chatas for a kohen gadol, but there's a little bit more nuance to the kohen moshiach. So, of course, first of all, it's going to be a cow instead of a she-goat, she-sheep, he-goat. It's going to be a cow. Now, as the name implies, kohen moshiach, right? The kohen moshiach is the kohen gadol, but not just any kohen gadol. It's the kohen gadol that was anointed with the shemen hamishcha. There's two ways for a kohen gadol to become kohen gadol. One way is to be anointed with the shemen hamishcha. Now, we no longer have the shemen hamishcha. Even in the second Beis Hamikdash, there was no longer the shemen hamishcha. So it was impossible to anoint kohanim gedolim with the shemen hamishcha when it didn't exist, when we didn't have it available to us. So the other way to become a kohen gadol is simply to put on the 8 garments of the kohen gadol. Of course, the kohen hedjot wears 4. Big day kohen 4 garments. A kohen hedjot has 4 garments. A kohen gadol has 8 garments. So that's called a kohen miruba begadim. That you put on the extra garments of the kohen gadol, the 8 garments of the kohen gadol, and you go and work in the Beis Hamikdash. You are now the kohen gadol. So the kohen moshiach is not for all Kohanim Gedolim. It's only for Kohanim Gedolim who became Kohanim Gedolim with the Shemen HaMishcha. Okay? Now, for what Averis are they, or is a par Kohen Mashiach brought? It is not the exact equivalent of a Korban Chatas. And in that classic example of Korban Chatas, you thought you ate Shuman, you find out later that you ate Chelev. Actually, a Kohen Mashiach, a Kohen Gadol, a Kohen Mashiach, actually would not bring any Korban at all in that case, actually. A Kohen Mashiach brings a par Kohen Mashiach in a context that is similar to the par Elam Davar Shel Tzibor. What does that mean? Well, when is a par Elam Davar Shel Tzibor brought? Well, when the Sanhedrin makes a decision, makes a halachic psak, and they make a mistake in their halachic psak, and then based on their mistaken psak, Am Yisrael then goes, the Tzibor then goes and acts on it, and does the nevera by accident. For example, a classic example, Chelev, the Sanhedrin mistakenly ruled that a particular Chelev is mutter, and then all of the Tzibor, all of Am Yisrael went, and they all ate that Chelev, so then you would bring a par Elam Davar Shel Tzibor. That is the similar context in which a Kohen Mashiach brings a par Kohen Mashiach, i.e., so the Kohen Gadol, of course, is a Talmud Chacham. We're going to learn about that at the bottom of Zayin Amud Aleph. He has to be Ra'ui, Lo Ra. He has to be a Mufle. He has to be a big Talmud Chacham and a Posek. And he paskins for himself. Let's say that a particular type of Chelev is mutter. And then he goes and he eats that Chelev, right? Similar to Par Elam Davar Shel Tzibor. Sanhedrin ruled a particular type of Chelev is mutter, and then everybody went and ate that Chelev. So this is a similar thing, but just for a Kohen Gadol, a Kohen Mashiach. He ruled for himself that, this particular Chelev is mutter, so he went and he ate it. And then he realizes, oops, I made a mistake, this Chelev is asur. So he brings a par Kohen Mashiach. So the important thing there is that for a Kohen Mashiach to be chayiv, to bring a par Kohen Mashiach, there has to be He'elem Davar Im Shigigas Mais. I'm going to repeat that, partially because I keep on forgetting it, so I have to repeat it for myself to drill it into my head. But also for us, the key for a par Kohen Mashiach, and as well as par Elam Davar Shel Tzibor, is He'elem Davar Im Shigigas Maise, that there was a mistaken ruling which led to an avera that happened by accident. The Kohen Mashiach mistakenly ruled that a particular type of Chelev is mutter, which led to him eating that particular type of Chelev. In that case, he would bring a par Kohen Mashiach. However, in a case that is simply Shigagas Maisa, a simple mistake, for example, he thought that he was eating Shuman, but it turns out he was eating Chelev, a Kohen Mashiach would bring no korban at all in that case. Not a par Kohen Mashiach, not a korban chatos. That's it. That is the explainer. So a sa'ir nasi is be'etzem the equivalent of a korban chatas, but for a king, it's literally the equivalent. It's the same as a korban chatas, just that if you're the king, instead of a kispa v'sira, you bring a sa'ir. A par kohen Mashiach is essentially the korban chatas, so to speak, of a kohen Mashiach, but it's more specific. It's much more similar to a par Elam Davar Shel Tzibor for a kohen Mashiach, and that is the only korban that he would bring. Kilu, there would not be any other kind of korban chatas. So if he accidentally ate chelev, no korban whatsoever. Okay, friends, we are going to begin on Daf Vav. We're going to begin, sort of the Mishnah. We're going to begin the second parak of Masechet Horayos on Daf Vav Amud Beis at the new Mishnah, at the new parak. Hore kohen Mashiach le'atzmo. Oh, so there you go. As we were just discussing, a kohen Mashiach, which again is a kohen gadol that was anointed with the Shemen HaMishcha, the Kohen Mashiach ruled for himself. Just like the Sanhedrin ruled by the Par Elam Davar Shel Tzibor, this Kohen Gadol ruled for himself that this particular Chelev is mutter. Shogeg, and he did this by accident, he accidentally ruled that this particular type of Chelev is mutter. Ve'osa Shogeg, and because he accidentally ruled that this particular Chelev is mutter, he then accidentally ate this particular Chelev. He thought that the Chelev was mutter, so he ate it. Maybe par. So in that case, the Kohen Mashiach brings a par Kohen Mashiach. Shoigeg v'asa mezid, if he inadvertently ruled about this chaylev, let's say, and then he realized, wait, I made a mistake, but he went ahead and ate the chaylev anyways, right? So shogeg, he accidentally ruled that way about the chaylev, but v'asa mezid, but then he ate the chaylev knowing that he shouldn't be eating it. Mezid v'asa shogeg, or if he, for some reason, intentionally ruled for himself that the chaylev is mutter, even though you knew that it wasn't, but then I guess he forgot that he ruled that way or something, v'asa shogeg, and he ate it, ended up eating it by accident. This seems like funny kind of scenarios. Potter. In that case, he doesn't bring a parlem davar tzibur. Okay. A par kohen moshiach. Shoras kohen moshiach le'atzmo. Koras bezdin litzibur. Because there is a parallel between the kohen moshiach ruling, paskening for himself, and then acting based on that psak. There's a parallel between that to, similarly, with the tzibur, you have the Sanhedrin ruling, paskening, and the tzibur then acting based on that psak. This is what's referred to as He'elem Dover im Shigigas Maisem. We're going to see that explicitly at the last Mishnah of, we're going to see 3 Mishnayos today. If we get to the third one, I'd like to get to the third one. So we'll see 3 Mishnayos today. That will be in the third Mishnah, He'elem Dover im Shigigas Maisem, but it's going to be coming up throughout the daf. So now says the Gemara, Shogeg, also Shogeg may be par pshita. Okay. The Mishnah had said that if he accidentally rules that a particular chaylev is mutter, and then he accidentally eats that chaylev based on his ruling, so he brings a par kohen moshiach. Pshita, we want to say that it's obvious that if that's the case, if it was a complete shogeg, we want to say that it's obvious that he would bring a par kohen moshiach in that case. And Rabbi says, Abai ochav ma'eskinon. Here, what are we talking about? Kigon shehoro v'shochach me'ezet ta'amor. Interesting. That, well, he had ruled, let's say that this particular chaylev is mutter, and now there's this particular chaylev is on a plate in front of him, and he says, okay, I'm going to eat this because I remember, for some reason I ruled that this chaylev was actually mutter. I can't remember why, but I do know for sure that I decided that this chaylev was mutter, so I'm going to eat it. Again, I don't remember why I came to that conclusion, but I do know for sure that I came to that conclusion, so I'm going to eat this chaylev. Right, so that he paskened for himself that this type of chaylev was muter v'shochach me'ezet ta'amor, but he forgot for what his rationale was to say that this chaylev is muter. Also Omar harini osa das ora osi, and at the time that he then went and ate this chaylev, he said, I'm eating this chaylev because I came to the conclusion that this chaylev is mutter. To my detem, I may have thought that kevan de ilu misidale shema hader. I may have thought to say that since if he would have remembered his rationale, he would have said, what was I thinking? This is not mutter, this is aser. So kimeze dami v'lo l'chayit kamash malan. So maybe it would be considered like he was a mazid, intentional, negligent maybe, but mazid, and therefore he should bring a korban. Meaning, therefore, v'lo l'chayit, and therefore he should not be chayiv to bring a par kohen moshiach. Therefore, kamash malan that he is chayiv. Meaning, okay, we said that in a scenario where a kohen moshiach rules that a particular for himself that a particular type of chaylev is mutter, and then he goes and he eats it. So he's chayiv par kohen moshiach. So we said though that our Mishnah specifically is talking about the chiddush of our Mishnah said it's talking about a scenario where the kohen gadol had ruled for himself that yes, this particular chaylev is mutter, but then at the time that he was eating it, he forgot the rationale why. All he remembers is that he definitely ruled for himself that this chaylev is mutter, so he went and he ate it. So I may have thought that that would be considered more of a mazid because at the time that he ate the chaylev, he didn't remember the reason why. And maybe if he did remember the reason why, he would have said, what was I thinking? And therefore it was almost as if he was like irresponsible for eating this chaylev, which it turned out to be that it was that it was usur, and he went ahead and ate it, even without knowing the reason why he was eating it. Maybe if you remember the reason why he was eating it, he would have realized that he shouldn't be eating it, and he went ahead and ate it anyways. Still, he brings a par kohen moshiach, since it was based on the ruling that he had made previously. So as I mentioned earlier, by a par kohen moshiach, it is specifically brought for helim dover im shigigas maise. As we've already been discussing, that the par kohen moshiach is only brought when the kohen gadol issued a ruling, and then he acted based on that ruling. And again, this is going to be a theme that is going to be coming out throughout the daf. We are now learning where that comes from. Right, this is as opposed to shigigas maisa. Shigigas maisa would just be if you inadvertently did it in a avera. Classic case being, you thought you were reading Shuman. Turns out you ate chaylev. You'd bring your korban chatas for that. Not if you're the kohen gadol though, because that's just shigigas maisa. We need helem dover shigigas maisa. I'm going to keep on forgetting that thing, and it's going to take me a second to remember those phrases. I should probably write it down somewhere. But anyways, helem dover im shigigas maise. How do we know that by par kohen moshiach it requires there be a helem dover im shigigas maise, that an inadvertent ruling which leads to a mistaken action? So now, how do we know this helem dover im shigigas maise? Well, the rabbi thought leoshmas ha'am moshiach kitzibur. Well, it says by a kohen moshiach. Im a kohen, I'm reading the pasuk. Im a kohen a moshiach yachta leosh masa'am. If the kohen moshiach sins, leosh masa'am, ha'am, the nation. We're comparing the kohen moshiach to the tzibur, to the people, and therefore, just like by the people, by the palim davar shel tzibur, it's helem davar im shigigas maise. It's an inadvertent ruling which led to a mistaken action, an incorrect action. So also by the kohen Mashiach, it's going to be an inadvertent ruling for himself, which led him to take an incorrect action. So again, how do we know? I'm going to use these phrases, by the way. Okay, let's actually just, I feel like there's a lot of building for this daf, a lot of concepts and things we got to settle on this daf. So let's also settle on this. Helem dovrim shigigas maise. That's a concept that let's get familiar with, because I'm just going to be using it. Helem dovrim shigigas maise is the inadvertent ruling which leads to a mistaken action, right? Like by the Sanhedrin and the Palim Davar Shel Tzibur, also by the Kohen Mashiach. And then there's simply shigigas maise, which is just simply a mistaken action, which is just like you think you're eating Shuman, you ate chaylev, or it could even be like on Shabbos, you accidentally more machal Shabbos, you have to bring korban chatas. That's classic korban chatas mistakes are shigigas maise. Helim davar im shigigas maise is what's unique to Parim davar shel tzibur and par kohen Mashiach. Okay, so I'm just going to be using those phrases. Cool. So just take a second to let that sink in if you need. Now, valodinu. Now, affect the Gemara. Why do I need the pasuk of le'osh masa'om in order to make this connection between Kohen Mashiach and the Tzibur? I can just use my noggin. I can use my own brains to make the connection between the Kohen Mashiach and the Tzibur, between the Par Kohen Mashiach and the Parim Davar Shel Tzibur. Because after all, Tzibur Motza Michlal Yochid, Tzibur is different, is removed from an individual, because a Tzibur doesn't just bring a regular Korban Chatas, it brings a Par Elam Davar Shel Tzibur. And similarly, Umashiach Motza Michlal Yochid, and a Kohen Mashiach also doesn't bring the regular Korban Chatas, he brings a Par Kohen Mashiach. Matzibur ein chayav elo al helem davrim shigigas maise, and therefore, just like the tzibur is only chayav to bring their par when it's helem davrim shigigas maise, so also ap Mashiach lo yeh chayav elo al helem davrim shigigas maise. So therefore, I will say also that by a kohen moshiach, he's only chayiv to bring the par kohen moshiach when there is shigigas helim dover im shigigas ma'aseh. So the Gemara suggests, the Gemara asks, why do I need the pasuk of le'osh masa'am to make the connection between the kohen moshiach and the tzibur? I could just use my own brains. Pa'ilim davar shel tzibur is not a regular korban chatas, it's a par rather than a kispa v'sira. And the same thing by a kohen moshiach. So therefore, just like by pa'ilim davar shel tzibur, it's helim davar im shigigas ma'aseh. So by the kohen moshiach as well, it'll be helim davar im shigigas ma'aseh. But in fact, the Gemara, not so fast. Not so fast. Because okalich l'derech zo, because I'll say similarly, nasi motzi michlal yachid, a king is unique from a regular individual. Moshiach motzi michlal yachid, and so is a kohen moshiach, right? The king, when he sins, he brings a sa'ir rather than a kispa osira. And of course, a kohen moshiach brings a par kohen moshiach. So let's compare a nasi, and let's compare Mashiach to nasi rather than comparing Mashiach to tzibur, and say, Ma nasi maybe b'shigigas ma'aseh below elam davar. So let's say that just like a nasi, he brings his korban even just for shigigas ma'aseh, even by just regular old mistakes, regular old averes. For example, he thought he was eating shuman, and he ended up eating chayla. A nasi will bring a sa'ir nasi for that. So Mashiach may be b'shigigas ma'aseh below elam davar. So I'll argue that a kohen Mashiach also, just like a nasi, would bring a par kohen Mashiach even for simply shigigas ma'aseh, even without the helim davar first. So the Gemara says, well, near limidome. Okay, so now we have a fork in the road. One direction is to compare kohen Mashiach to tzibur. The other can say that it's helim davar m'shigigas ma'aseh. The other direction is to compare kohen Mashiach with nasi, and say that just like nasi brings the sir nasser even by simply shigigas ma'aseh, so I'll say that the kohen Mashiach also would bring the par kohen Mashiach simply for shigigas ma'aseh. No need for the helim davar first. So let's see which one is the better comparison. Tzibur b'par ve'en mevin oshim talui. Well, the congregation brings a cow, par helim davar shel tzibur. Also, the congregation is not shaykh to Oshim Talu. There's no Oshim Talui when it comes to the congregation. Oshim Talui is, as we've seen, I believe, is offered when there is a suffix whether you have to bring in korban chatas. For example, if you thought you were eating shuman, and then somebody says, wait, that might have been chaylev. Meaning, if they would say, wait, that was chaylev, so you would say, oops, I accidentally ate chaylev, let me bring a korban chatas. But here, they said, it may have been chaylev. So now you don't know. If it was chaylev, so you bring a korban chatas. If it's not chaylev, then it was shuman, you don't have to do anything. But you're not sure. So in that case, you bring what's called an ashram talui. The tzibur, ashram talui are not brought for tziburs. So therefore, we're saying that a tzibur brings a par, a cow, and also ashram talui does not apply to tziburs. Moshiach, and similarly a kohen Mashiach, bipar, brings a cow, just like the tzibur, par kohen Mashiach, ve'ein maybe ashram talui. And he also doesn't bring an ashram talui. So matzibur enu chayiv ela al helim davar shigigas ma'aseh, and therefore, just like the tzibur is only chayiv when it's helim davar shigigas ma'aseh, so ap Mashiach, so also by the kohen Mashiach, lo yeh chayiv ela al helim davar shigigas ma'aseh, so he's only going to be chayiv for helim davar shigigas ma'aseh, just like the tzibur. Okal chaderech zo. But one second, I'll make the pro-king argument. Nasi maybe sira b'avodas kochavim umayvi asham vadai, that a nasi, a king, if he worshipped avodah zarah by accident, so he brings a seira, a shigot, and also he's shaykh to an Osham Vadai and an Osham Me'ilos, for example, Osham Gzelos. Moshiach maybe Sir Bavodas Chum, maybe Osham Vadai. And also, a kohen moshiach, if he accidentally worships Avodah Zarah, so he also brings a she-goat. And also if he, Osham Me'ilos, Osham Gzelos, whatever, the Kohen Gadol would bring those as well if he needs to. Both of which would not be relevant to the tzibur. There's no Osham Vadai by the tzibur. And there's no, right, but when it comes to Avodas Kochavim, it wouldn't be a se'ira, it would be a par and a sa'ir, if we're talking about the congregation. So therefore, we can argue that the Kohen Gadol and the Nasi have similarities. They share the se'ira by the Avodah Zarah as well as an Osham Vadai when relevant. So Manosi maybe b'shigas ma'aseh, Mashiach maybe b'shigas ma'aseh. So let's say that just like let's compare the Kohen Mashiach to the Nasi. Just like the Nasi brings a Sa'ir Nasi b'shigas ma'aseh even without the Helim Dover. So let's say the same thing by the Kohen Mashiach b'shigas ma'aseh. I'll bring a par Kohen Mashiach. So Talmud lo mar la'osh masa'om. That is why we in fact need la'osh masa'om to say forget it. Don't compare the Kohen Mashiach to the Nasi. Rather, compare the Kohen Mashiach to the Tzibur. Harei Mashiach ketzibur, ma tzibur eino mevi elo, al helem davrim shigigas maise, hap Mashiach eino mevi, el helem davrim shigigas maise. So we see that just like the tzibur is only chayv a parlem davar shel tzibur when it's helem davrim shigigas maise, so therefore a Kohen Mashiach as well is chayv a par Kohen Mashiach for helem davar im shigigas maise. That is what that's why we need la'osh masa'am to say don't compare the Kohen Mashiach to the Nasi, rather compare the Kohen Mashiach to the Tzibur. Even ma Tzibur hora v'osu acherim bora also chayavin. In fact, the Gemara, when it comes to the Tzibur, so you have the Sanhedrin ruling and the Tzibur doing. So you have the ruling and then others are doing, and you bring a parlam davar shel Tzibur. So I'll argue that Af Mashiach also, when it comes to the Kohen Mashiach, when he rules, that let's say chelev is permitted, also acherim bara also, and then other people went and ate the chelev based on his ruling, yeh chayiv, you should have to bring a par Kohen Mashiach for that. Just like parlam davar shel Tzibur, you have the Sanhedrin ruling and other people doing. So here also, if the Kohen Gadol rules that a particular chelev is mutar and other people then eat the chelev because of that ruling, maybe he should have to bring a par Kohen Mashiach. Talmud lo mar v'ikav al chatoso asher chota al ma shechota hu maybe al ma shechotu acherim. That the Kohen Mashiach brings the par Kohen Mashiach only for his inadvertent sins, not for anybody else's. So there you have it. We compare the Kohen Mashiach to the Tzibur, and we say that just like by the Tzibur, there's a chiyuv par elam davar shel Tzibur when there's helem davar im shigas maise. So also by the Kohen Mashiach, there's a par Kohen Mashiach when there's helem davar im shigas maise, not for shigas maise alone. Okay, so this next bit is like a little bit tricky. So I'm going to explain it outside first and then read it inside. Basically, we had suggested earlier, right? So the Gemara, the section of the Gemara had started out by saying that how do we know Helem Davrim Shigigas Maise by the Kohen Mashiach? Well, because of Le'oshmas Ha'am, the Pasuk says Le'oshmas Ha'am by the Kohen Mashiach, and therefore we're comparing the Kohen Mashiach to the to the Tzibur, and just like by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur, it's Helem Davar Im Shigigas Maise, so therefore also by the Kohen Mashiach, it is Helem Davar Im Shigigas Maise. And then the Gemara had suggested, wait, maybe we don't need the pasuk. Let's just use our own brains in order to arrive at this conclusion of Helem Davar Im Shigigas Maise. What was the argument to use our brains? To say, well, and this is what this next piece is going on. Well, the Kohen Mashiach is similar to the Tzibur. How is the Kohen Mashiach similar to the Tzibur? Well, both of them, both the Kohen, but the Par Kohen Mashiach and the Par Davar shel tzibur, they're both cows. They're both parim. So that's one similarity that the kohen moshiach has with the tzibur, is that they're bringing cows. And the second similarity that they have is that they don't bring asham talus. And this is what the Gemara is asking about, because that one's a little bit weird. Why is that a little bit weird? Well, first of all, how come there's no asham tali? How come? So the reason is because the pasuk says by asham talui, it says v'chiper olav hakohen al shigigaso asher shogag. It says by asham talui that the kohen will, you're not sure, did you eat chilib, did you not eat chilib? So you bring an asham talui in, and then the kohen will atone for him for his shogeg that he shogeg. Mi shechetov shigigaso shove. Be'etzem what that means is shigigas maise. That you bring a asham talui in a scenario where somebody would be chayiv for shigigas maise alone, not in a scenario where the chiyuv is for helem dover im shigigas maise. So therefore, the tzibur, where you bring a pilem dover shel tzibur only by helem dover im shigigas maise, so that's not shaykh to an ashram tali, because ashram tali would be in scenarios where you'd be chayiv for shigigas maise alone, not for He'elim dover im shigigas maise, and therefore tzibur is excluded. But chevra, we said that tzibur is excluded from ashram tali, but so is kohen moshiach. That was a thing that they had. That was a common thread between the two, right? Both by kohen moshiach and tzibur, you bring a par in both cases, and both are exempt by ashram tali. I just explained to you why tzibur is exempt from ashram tali, because it requires shigigas maise alone, and by the tzibur it's helim davrim shigigas maise. But why would the kohen moshiach be exempt from an ashram tali? Well, for the same reason, because of helim davrim shigigas maise. By kohen moshiach, there's helim davrim shigigas maise. The thing is, we don't actually know that yet, right? That it's a bit of a rabbit hole, but that was the whole point, right? The Gemara had started out by saying, how do we know that this is exactly what we're trying to learn? How do we know Helam Dover im Shigigas Maise by Kohen Mashiach? Because of the pasuk of L'ashma Sa'am, that we compare the Kohen Mashiach to the Tzibur, just like by the Tzibur it's Shigigas Maise, Helam Dover im Shigigas Maise, also by Kohen Mashiach there's Helam Dover im Shigigas Maise. But then we said, no, we don't want to learn from the pasuk. We want to use our brains, and therefore it makes sense to say that Kohen Mashiach should be compared to the Tzibur, because both Kohen Mashiach and Tzibur have in common that they bring a par, and that they're exempt from, that they don't bring ashram talus. But the whole exemption from an ashram talu is based on the fact that it's helim davar im shigigas maise. And while I know helim davar im shigigas maise by the Tzibur, we don't yet know that by the Kohen Moshiach. That's exactly what we're trying to figure out, which we wanted to learn out from Ashma Sa'am, and which the Gemara is saying, no, we don't need Ashma, we don't need Ashma Sa'am, let's just learn it out on our own. But if we're trying to learn it on our own, then we haven't actually learned it out yet. So how can we make that comparison and say, well, they both have in common that it's not shaykh to Asham Talui, but the only reason to say that Kohen Moshiach is not shaykh to Asham Talui is based on the fact that there's a requirement of Helam Davar Shigas Maisa, but we don't actually know that yet. That's the conclusion that we're trying to arrive at. Did you get that? It's a little bit of like a subtle thing, but basically it's like jumping the gun and saying that, yeah, it's a bit of a route. It's like a catch-22, like an infinite loop kind of thing, right? It's like, how do we know Helim Davar Shigas Maisa by Kohen Mashiach? Well, because we compare it to Tzibur, let's compare it to Tzibur because they have things in common. They're both par and they're not shaykh to Ashram Talu. Therefore, let's compare them and say that Helam Davar Shigas Maise by both scenarios. But we haven't. The whole point of comparing them is that we can learn that Helam Davar Shigas Maise by both scenarios, and we're saying that let's compare them because they have this thing in common. That there's no Ashram Talus. There's no Ashram Talus because it's Helam Davar Shigas Maise. We don't yet know that it's Helam Davar Shigas Maise. And it's a bit of a rabbit hole, infinite loop catch-22 kind of thing. So now let's read it inside. It says the Gemara, Amar, we said earlier, Moshiach bipar ve'ein maybe ashum tali, that by a kohen moshiach, the korban is a par kohen moshiach, and also he doesn't bring an ashum tali. Right? That was a something that kohen moshiach has in common with the tzibur, and why we should compare them to each other to conclude helim davar m'shigas ma'aseh by par kohen moshiach. But minale de'ein maybe ashum tali. But then, one second, why are we assuming at that point in the Gemara that a kohen moshiach does not bring an ashum talui? Well, because by ashum talui it says that the kohen will atone for him for his shogeg, for his mistake that he mistaked, which essentially means shigigas ma'aseh alone. Yatsa Mashiach, and therefore that excludes kohen Mashiach from ashum talui. Shein shigigaso v'chataso shave, because a kohen Mashiach doesn't bring a korban for shigigas ma'aseh alone. Tichsiv la'ashmas ha'am harei Mashiach kitzibur. Because since we have the pasuk of the ashmas ha'am to compare the kohen Mashiach to the nation, and just like the nation is for he'elim davar im shigigas ma'aseh, so to the kohen Mashiach is he'elim davar im shigigas ma'aseh, not for shigigas ma'aseh alone. But frag the Gemara la'ashmas ha'am al korchich lo ka'amar le. But the whole point is that at that point in the Gemara, we were trying to avoid using la'ashmas ha'am. So how could we use la'ashmas ha'am to conclude he'elim davar m'shigigas ma'aseh by kohen Mashiach in order to conclude that by kohen Mashiach there's no ashum tali, if the whole point is that we're not using la'ashmas ha'am at that point? So ela ashum kadin azma. Okay, forget it. Drop the ashum tali thing. Drop the ashum tali comparison. Not important. We don't need it. In the end, we said, let's try to compare it to the tzibur. We said, maybe let's try to compare it to the nasi. In the end, we had to say, okay, we need the pasuk of la'ashmas ha'am. That's why we compare the kohen Mashiach to the tzibur, and that's how we know he'elim davar m'shigigas ma'aseh. Forget about the ashum tali thing. It's unnecessary, and the logic doesn't work out. Okay, now we get up to the next Mishnah, which discusses the relationship between par kohen Mashiach and par he'elim davar shel tzibur. Let's jump into the Mishnah to see exactly what we mean by that. Hora b'fnei atzmo v'osa b'fnei atzmo miskaber lo b'fnei atzmo. So this is talking about a scenario where, let's say the Sanhedrin had made a ruling that you're allowed to bow down to Markulis. And all the tzibur went and they bowed down to Markulis. And then Beis Din realized, oops, that was a mistake. So we have to bring a par he'elim davar shel tzibur. At the same time, the kohen Mashiach had ruled for himself that a particular type of chelev is mutter, and he went and ate that chelev. So the tzibur needs to bring actually not a par he'elim davar shel tzibur, it would be a par v'sa'ir for avodah zarah. So the tzibur needs to bring that. The kohen Mashiach needs to bring a par. So we say that he needs to bring his par. You can't say, well, the tzibur is already bringing korbanos. Maybe I'll just chaperine with them. I don't need to bring a korban. No, he needs to bring a korban, since they're two different things, right? Hora b'fnei atzmo, if he ruled for himself, i.e. in his own unique scenario, ve'osa b'fnei atzmo, and he acted based on his own unique ruling, miskaper lo b'fnei atzmo, so he's got to bring his own par. However, hora imat tzibur, what if Sanhedrin had ruled that a particular type of chelev is mutter, so everybody went and ate the chelev, and he had also arrived at that same conclusion, and he also ate chelev. Right? So simultaneously, Sanhedrin and the kohen Mashiach ruled about the same thing. Okay? So again, hora im atzibur, he ruled, he made a psak for himself, together with the Sanhedrin making a psak for the tzibur. V'asa im atzibur, and just like the tzibur ate that chelev, so did he. Miskapelo im atzibur, okay, so he doesn't need to bring his own cow in this case. He can be covered by the par he'elim davar shel tzibur. She'ein bezin chayav and ad sheyoru levatul miktsas ulekayim miktsas v'chein HaMashiach. Because Bezdin is only chayiv to bring a par helem davar shel tzibur in a scenario where, as we learned in the first parak, they're not getting rid of, let's say, they're not deleting Shabbos. They're just saying a particular halacha of Shabbos is mutter, and similarly the kohen moshiach as well, right? They have similar parameters of when they would be chayiv to bring their respective korbanos, and therefore, if they ruled about the same topic, so then the kohen moshiach would not have to bring his own par. He could go along with the par of the tzibur. Now, and similarly by avodah zarah, there would only be a korban by the tzibur. And interestingly, the Mishnah doesn't say v'chein moshiach by avodah zarah. Do we taka say it's? I think we taka say it's actually a machlokes by avodah zarah. Okay, it's a machlokes by avodah zarah. We're going to get to later on. Although I'm not actually sure it's a machlokes by avodah zarah by this particular halacha. But anyways, it doesn't say v'chein moshiach by avodah zarah. It could be that the same thing is though by avodah zarah, both by the kohen moshiach as well as by the tzibur. That it would be based on a psak that is not to get rid of avodah zarah completely, but a particular halacha of avodah zarah. For example, if they rule that it's permitted to bow down to Markulis, and they realized that was a mistake. Says the Gemara, immediately, how do we know these halachas in our Mishnah? Let's go weiter. The Tanur Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Hora imat tzibur. So if he rules, if the kohen moshiach ruled together with the tzibur, but also imat tzibur, and he also acted with the tzibur, so the Sanhedrin ruled a particular type of chaylev is mutter, and the kohen gadol arrived at the same conclusion, and everyone's eating that particular type of chaylev. So Yochel Yavi Par La'atzmo, would the kohen moshiach bring his own par? Vidinu. Well, let's use our noggins. Nasi motza michlal yochid u'mashiach motza michlal yochid. Well, both a king, both a nasi as well as the kohen mashiach, are removed from the regular individuals, right? Individuals being a kisp of a seira for a korban chatas. The nasi brings a sa'ir. The kohen mashiach brings a par. They are kind of separate, right? They have their differences from individuals. So my nasi chota b'fnei atzmo, maybe b'fnei atzmo chota matzibur miskapelo matzibur. So therefore, I'll say that just like by the king, if he does his own unique mistake, so he brings his own unique korban, the sa'ir nasi. But if the nasi were to sin together with the rest of the nation, right? If the Sanhedrin ruled that a particular type of chaylev is mutter, and everybody ate that type of chaylev, including the nasi, he wouldn't bring his own korban. He would go along with the parlam davar shel tzibur. So let's say the same thing. Af Mashiach. Let's say the same thing then by a kohen Mashiach. Chata b'fnei atzmo, maybe b'fnei atzmo. Chata matzibur miskapelo matzibur. That if the kohen Mashiach does his own unique accidental sin, so then he'll bring his own unique korban. But if he's doing the same thing as everybody else, well then the parlam davar shel tzibur will cover the kohen Mashiach as well. But for the Gemara, one second. Let's not compare the kohen Mashiach to the king. How come? Well, because I can understand why the king would be included in the parlam davar shel tzibur. After all, on Yom Kippur, the king is included with the rest of Am Yisrael, with the Sayer Anaisa Bifnim, and he gets atonement with the rest of Am Yisrael on Yom Kippur, and therefore he gets atonement with the rest of Am Yisrael by the parlam davar shel tzibur as well. But by a kohen Mashiach on Yom Kippur, he has his own cow. The Kohanim have their own cow. They don't get their atonement with the Sayer Anaisa Bifnim. Theirs is the par. Is their own cow. So I can argue, right? So Tomer b'Mashiach she'ein miskapelo imatzibu b'yom kippurim. Since the kohen moshiach on Yom Kippur doesn't get atonement with the rest of Am Yisrael, so I'll say that he also doesn't get atonement with the rest of Am Yisrael when it comes to chaylev and the parlem davar shel tzibur. He can't get atonement with them. And therefore, since the kohen moshiach doesn't get atonement with the rest of Am Yisrael, since the kohen moshiach doesn't get atonement with the rest of Am Yisrael on Yom Kippur, so I'll suggest that also he would have to bring his own cow. Right? If everybody ate chaylev and he also ate chaylev, he should have to bring it. He can't get atonement with everybody else with the parlem davar shel tzibur. He'll have to bring his own par. Therefore, the pasuk says on his sin that he sinned, haketzad haso chata b'fnei atzmo, maybe b'fnei atzmo. Look, if he sins on his own, right? The Bezdin ruled about avodah zarah. He's ruling for himself about chaylev. Okay, so he brings his own cow. But chata imat tzibur. But if he sins together with the tzibur, miskaber lo imat tzibur. So then he'll get kapara with the rest of the tzibur, the parlem davar shel tzibur, right? Meaning al chatos o shechoto, when he does his own unique chait, so then he brings his own par. But if he's doing the same thing as everybody else, then he can get his atonement with the parlem davar shel tzibur, no problem. Hechidami. Now, what are we talking about in terms of the kohen gadol and his erudition? How big of a Talmud Chacham is he? If we're talking about a scenario where, okay, so the kohen gadol ruled for himself about chaylev, and the Sanhedrin happened to have also ruled about chaylev. And if we're talking about where he is a big Talmud Chacham, but the Sanhedrin not so much, or at least the mufla sheb Sanhedrin was not there. I think that we already saw this Mishnah the other day, I believe. Right? Was it Horu Bezim? Yeah, right. Oh, Shalo, Mufla Shal Bezdin Sham. That was on Daf Daled Amivez, right? We need the Bezdin to be top notch. So if we're talking about where he is top notch, but they're not, the Bezdin is not, the Sanhedrin is not top notch, or they don't have the Mufla Shal Bezdin there. Pshita the Miskapelo B'fnei Atzmo. Certainly, then he would have to bring his own par, because Ara Dilhon V'lo Klum. Because if the Sanhedrin is not, they don't have the Mufla Sheba Bezdin there, they don't have the greatest sage and scholar in Talmud Chacham there, well then their ruling is irrelevant. And if their ruling is irrelevant, well then he's going to have to bring his own par for his own ruling about Chaleb for himself. And since the ruling of Sanhedrin is irrelevant, if they don't have the Mufla Sheba Bezdin there, well then every single person who ate Chaleb based on their ruling is not going to be exempted with the parlem davar shel tzibur, because there's not going to be a parlem davar shel tzibur. Every person is going to have to bring their own korban chatos. And if it's talking about where the Bezdin is mamash gavald, but he's not, so well then why is he bringing his own cow? If he's not a big Talmud Chacham, well then his own psak is worthless, and he's not going to bring a par kohen moshiach based on his psak if he's not a Talmud Chacham. So Amar Apape Kigon Shai Muflin Shnein. It's talking about where both the kohen moshiach as well as the Sanhedrin both top notch, and they both ruled mistakenly about Chalev. And the kohen gadol ate chaylev along with everybody else. So in that case, he doesn't need to bring his own cow. He can just rely upon the par, helem davar shel tzibur, and get atonement that way. Savar Ba'ilei thought to say, chata b'fnei atzmo v'asa b'fnei atzmo heichi dami, that in the scenario where he ruled for himself, we had said it was talking about that the Sanhedrin was talking about avodah zarah, and he was ruling about chaylev. So, betrays Surah. So Abai thought to say that what that's talking about in the Mishnah is that when the Sanhedrin and the Kohen Mashiach are ruling about different topics, for example, avodah zarah and Chaylev, and they're also in different locations. So Amalei Rav says to Abai, Atu Shnei Mekomas Gorman, Elafili Azve Bechad Mokim. So Rav says, no, the places are irrelevant. That's not what's important. It says no, who location is irrelevant. It doesn't matter where the kohen moshiach is and where the Sanhedrin is. What's important is that if they're talking about two different isurim, if the Sanhedrin is passing about avodah zarah and he's passing about chaylev, so then he will bring his own par. So says the Gemara, so certainly if he is ruling for himself about chaylev, and the Sanhedrin is ruling about avodah zarah, certainly he's going to bring it's going to be considered his own separate sin, and he's going to bring his own separate cow. Because they learned out from different psukim, avodah zarah and chaylev, and also they have different korbanos. Chaylev would be a par, avodah zarah is a par v'soyer. Dehu b'par v'hein b'par v'soyer. D'kamaisu ane soyer v'lo maisi. There, the difference is they would be, for their ruling, there would be a goat. For his, there's no goat, just a cow. And certainly, and certainly if he is ruling about avodah zarah and they are ruling about chaylev, because then the korbanos are completely different, because a kohen moshiach who inadvertently is over avodah zarah, if he paskins for himself about avodah zarah, let's say that you could bow down to markulis and he made a mistake, so he would bring a se'ira, and if they're ruling about chaylev, they would bring a par. Those are completely different korbanos. They have different korbanos legamri, completely. To se'ira, he would bring a se'ira for avodah zarah, ve'inu par, and they would be bringing a cow for the inadvertent ruling about chaylev. So Gemara says, what about a scenario where he ruled for himself about chaylev on the stomach, and they ruled about chaylev on the intestines? Mao, what happens there? So on the one hand, mi'aminan afal gav de korban and shavet, even though it's the same korban for chaylev, it would be a par. Since they come from different verses, so therefore we would treat them separately, and he would bring his own cow. Or do we say, look, chaylev is chaylev, so therefore they're both passing about the same thing, and he doesn't have to bring his own cow. He could rely upon the paralim davar shel tzibur imtim salomer shem chaylev echadu. And if you want to say that, yeah, it's all chaylev. Hu b'chaylev ve'im b'dam ma'u. Okay, what if he's ruling about chaylev and they're ruling about blood? Mi amina b'tarmayu a pligin. Do we say, well, it's different verses, different psukim, chaylev, dam, so therefore he would have to bring his own cow? Or do we came the shabim b'korban, pasu korban azlina? Or do we say, yeah, but at the end of the day, it would be the same korban, a cow. So therefore, we could say that he can get atonement with the paralim davar shel tzibur. He doesn't need to bring his own par. Teku. Let's go. Weiter. Shein bezdin chayovin ad sheyoru levato miktzas l'chayim miktzas v'chulei. Oh, so as we know, bezdin paralim davar shel tzibur is only, it's not when they delete an entire section of the Torah like Shabbos or avodah zarah. It's talking about when they say that a particular halacha is mutter, right? That not that they're deleting avodah zarah, but that it's permitted to bow down to markulis. Minalin that sheyoru levato miktzas l'kayim miktzas kedarminam b'idach pirkin minalim davar v'lo kol haguf. How do we know this? That it's not to delete the entire subject. It's like we learned in the previous parak that the pasuk says v'nelam davar v'lo kol haguf, a part, an aspect, but not the entire subject. V'chein moshiach, and similarly by a kohen moshiach, minolin had we know this, tichsev le'ashmasa moshiach kitzibur, because as we know from the pasuk, by the kohen moshiach it says le'ashmasa to compare the kohen moshiach to the people, to the nation, and therefore, just like the halacha by paralim davar shel tzibur is just to that when they permit a detail of a topic, not the whole topic. The same thing applies to the kohen moshiach, and also by avodah zarah, it would be when Bezdin rules not to delete the entire concept of avodah zarah, but that they say you're allowed to bow down to markulis, and then they realize they made a mistake. Minolin, how do we know this? By avodah zarah, the Tana Rabbanan, that we learned that the rabbis taught. The fisher yotza avodas kocham lidom ba'atzma, or that avodah zarah has its own psukim. There's the par elam davar shel tzibur. Right? The pasuk talks about the Palim Davar Shel Tzibur, Bez made a mistake, Chelev, whatever it is. And then Avodah Zarah has its own unique psukim. Right? The pasuk says, "Ve'im kol." I'm reading the pasuk. "Ve'im kol adas." Do we quote the pasuk? I don't think we quote the pasuk. Oh yeah, we do. We do quote the pasuk. Right? It says, "Ve'im kol adas Yisrael yishgu v'nelam davar me'enei hakol v'asos kom achas v'kom mizul Hashem lo sezenav Hashemu." Oh wait, is that? Oh no, I'm sorry. That's actually Palim Davar Shel Tzibur. But by Avodah Zarah it says, "V'oya me'enei ha'eda neses l'shgaga v'aso kol ha'eda parib and bakar," etc., etc., etc. So Avodah Zarah by the tzibur has its own psukim. So Yachol Yehu Chayovin Al Akiras Mitzvah Kula. So is it possible that Avodah Zarah also has its own unique halachas? That maybe by Avodah Zarah they would bring korbanos if Bezdin accidentally ruled to delete the entire halachas of Avodah Zarah. Nemakan me'enev nemalalim me'enei. Well, it says me'enei both by Palim Davar Shel Tzibur as well as by Avodah Zarah. Malalim bebezdin, avkanami bebezdin. Just like by Palim Davar Shel Tzibur, we're talking about the Sanhedrin. So also by Avodah Zarah, we're talking about the Sanhedrin. Malalim davar v'lo kol aguf, avkanami davar v'lo kol aguf. And just like by Palim Davar Shel Tzibur, we're talking about where Bezdin rules to say that a particular detail is permitted, not that the whole subject is permitted. So the same thing applies by Avodah Zarah when they rule that a detail of Avodah Zarah is permitted, not to say that the entire Avodah Zarah is deleted. All right, Chava, let's chaparayim one more Mishnah. Let's do one final push for Daf Zayin. Ein chayovin ela al helem dover im shigigas hamaise. Oh, so as we've been talking about throughout the Daf, says the Mishnah explicitly that by Palim Davar Shel Tzibur, it's going to be helem dover im shigigas hamaise. Bezdin inadvertently ruled with regard to, let's say, chelev, and then the people ate chelev based on the ruling. V'chein ha-moshiach, and similarly, by kohen, moshiach, as we've been saying, helem dover m'shigas ma'aseh. V'lo ba'avodas kochovim, ein chayovin elo al helem dover m'shigas ha'ma'aseh. And also, when it comes to avodah zarah, it would be, you'd only be chayav for helem dover m'shigas ma'aseh, that there was an inadvertent ruling, followed by by actions based on that ruling. And again, it doesn't say v'chein Mashiach here by helem davar m'shigas ma'aseh by avodah zarah. It does not say v'chein Mashiach, and the Gemara is going to talk about it. Minolan, how do we know helem davar m'shigas ma'aseh? The Tanur Rabbanan yishgu, that the pasuk says by Palim Davar Shel Tzibur yishgu. Yachol Yehu Chayovin Al Shigigas Ma'aseh. Is it possible they'd be chayav for a Palim Davar Shel Tzibur simply by Shigigas Ma'aseh, even without the Hora'as Bezdin? But I guess just if the people went and just ate chelev by accident, would you bring a Palim Davar Shel Tzibur for that time? Alomer Yishgu v'nelam Davar. Ein Chayovin Elo Al Helem Davar Im Shigigas Ma'aseh. There has to be a mistaken ruling paired with the inadvertent doing. And therefore, if Sanhedrin inadvertently rules that, let's say, a particular type of chelev is permitted, and then based on that ruling, everyone then went and ate chelev, so then there would be a Palim Davar Shel Tzibur. But if simply everybody just went and ate chelev on their own, by accident, there would be no Palim Davar Shel Tzibur. V'chein Moshiach. And similarly, by the kohen Moshiach. Minolan, how do we know this? Dichsiv la'oshmas, Mari Moshiach Kitzibur, as we saw already, and this is the third time already today that we're seeing this, that by the kohen Mashiach, it says la'oshmas ha'om, to compare Mashiach to the to the people, to the tzibur, and just like by the tzibur, it's helem dover im shigigas ma'aseh, so also the same would be by the kohen Mashiach. V'lo ba'avodas kochavim ela al helem dover im shigigas ma'aseh. Okay, and similarly by avodah zarah, when you would have the communal avodah zarah korbanis, the par le'ola and the sa'ir lechatos, that would be when Bezdin inadvertently rules not to delete. Would be when Bezdin inadvertently rules that, let's say, it's permitted to bow down to Markulis, and then everyone went and bowed down to Markulis. Because avodah zarah gets its own psukim, the communal avodah zarah psak gets its own psukim. Yachol yu chayavin al shigigas ha'maise. Is it possible that by avodah zarah they would be chayav? Meaning by palim davar shel tzibur we know that it's helim davar shigigas maise, but avodah zarah gets its own psukim. Maybe it doesn't have the requirement of helim davar shigigas maise. Maybe shigigas maise alone is enough. I guess if people just accidentally all bow down to Markulis even without a rule. So Ne'emar kan me'ene v'ne'melahol me'ene, well it says me'ene both by palim davar shel tzibur and by the korbanos for avodah zarah. Malalan ein chayavin ella al helim davar shigigas maise, avkan ein chayavin ella al helim davar shigigas maise. Just like by palim davar it's helim davar shigigas maise, so the same thing by avodah zarah. Now, interestingly, the Mishnah doesn't say v'chein moshiach by avodah zarah. In the Reisha, when it came to palim davar shel tzibur, we said helim davar shigigas maise, and we said v'chein moshiach. Now we start talking about avodah zarah, and we say also it needs to be helim davar shigigas maise, but it doesn't say v'chein moshiach, implying that by the kohen moshiach, by avodah zarah, there is no requirement for helim davar in shigigas maise. Shigigas maise alone would be enough for avodah zarah by a kohen moshiach. If he accidentally worship avodah zarah, he would be chayiv to bring, I guess it would be a se'ira. So Masni's money, Rebbe, our Mishnah is Rebbe, the Tana that we learn about some Mashiach, that when it comes to kohen Mashiach, when it comes to avodah zarah, Rebbe Yomi b'shigigas maise. Shigigas maise alone, he accidentally worshipped the avodah zarah, even without helim davar, even without giving himself a psak to say that it's mutter to bow down to Markulis, for example. No, he accidentally worshipped the avodah zarah, so he brings a korban for that. Shigigas maise alone. V'chacham omim be'helim davar. Whereas the Chacham say no. By avodah zarah also, there would be helim davar im shigigas maise. So our Mishnah that leaves out v'chein moshiach by avodah zarah means that by kohen moshiach, by avodah zarah, shigigas maise alone would be enough, like Rebbe, not like the Chacham. So the Mishnah is Rebbe. V'shavin shebesira. Now both the Chacham and Rebbe agree that by a kohen moshiach, the korban for avodah zarah would be a se'ira, a she-goat. V'shavin she'en mevi ashim tali, or, and both Rebbe and the Chacham agree that a kohen moshiach would not bring an ashim tali, which we'll discuss again soon. He discussed it earlier. We'll discuss it again soon. But Tizbira. So now the Gemara says, one second. We just said that, well, our Mishnah must not be the Chacham, must be Rebbe, that when our Mishnah says that by avodah zarah it's helim davar shigigas maise, but it doesn't say v'chein moshiach, implying that moshiach shigigas maise alone is enough for avodah zarah. So he said that it must be the opinion of Rebbe, who says shigigas maise is alone is enough for kohen moshiach by avodah zarah. But says the Gemara, not so fast. But this, bro, if we look at the next Mishnah that we'll start with tomorrow, it says ein bein, as in Chesed Aleph, ein bezdin chayav and achiyor b'davar shizdono karz v'shigagosu chatas v'chim moshiach v'lo ba'avodas chuchav achiyoru hadavar shizdono karz v'shigagos chatas, and it doesn't say b'chein moshiach there, and yet we know that when it comes to avodah zarah for a kohen moshiach, there is a requirement of zdono karz v'shigagos chatas, even though the Mishnah didn't say b'chein moshiach. So therefore, the Gemara is asking that just because the Mishnah doesn't say v'chein moshiach, doesn't mean that it isn't v'chein moshiach. It could still be that the same halacha is applied to the kohen moshiach, just like in the next Mishnah. Even though it doesn't say b'chein moshiach, there still would be a requirement for zdono karz v'shigagos chatas by avodah zarah for kohen moshiach. So here also, even though it doesn't say b'chein moshiach, the requirement would still apply for the kohen moshiach of helim davar shigigas maise by avodah zarah. So, effectively, where v'tizbra bizdono karz shigigas chatas mikatani. Does it say b'chein moshiach in the next Mishnah when it's talking about bizdono karz shigigas chatas? No, it doesn't. And yet, it still does apply to the kohen moshiach. Ella taniha v'odinah. Look in the next Mishnah. When the Reisha talks about, right, ein bezin, right, it says in the Reisha, ein bezin chayav and sheyoru b'davar shezdono karz shigigas chatas v'chein ha-mashiach. And guess what? Just like it's v'chein Mashiach in the Reisha, also in the Seifa. And Hochinami, like this also in our Mishnah, Tanaha v'adin laha. In the Reisha, it says v'chein Mashiach, and the same applies to the Seifa by the Avodah Zarah. The requirement for Helam Davar and Shigigas Maaseh would be for the Moshiach as the kohen Moshiach as well. My time with the Rebbe, how come Rebbe says that by Avodah Zarah, by kohen Moshiach, there's no requirement for Helam Davar and Shigigas Maaseh? Amar Kol, the pasuk says v'chipar hakohen al hanefesh, that by Avodah Zarah, the pasuk says that the kohen will atone for the sin al hanefesh hashogeges becheto bishkaga, in its mistaken sin. Hanefesh ze moshiach, hashogeges ze nasi. Becheto bishkaga, Rebbe holds chet ze bishkaga, that this sin by Avodah Zarah was just by shigigas maaseh alone, even without helim davar. V'rabbanan tzava, the Rebbe holds shechatosu bishkaga, that when the pasuk says v'chipar hakohen al hanefesh hashogeges becheto bishkaga, it means mishechatosu bishkaga, that when it says becheto bishkaga, which means shigigas maaseh alone, so that would be shigigas maaseh alone by Avodah Zarah for somebody who generally, when it comes to mitzvahs, to mistaken averis, would be chayav a korban chatos for shigigas maaseh alone. Yatsa Mashiach, to the exclusion of a kohen Mashiach, shein chatosu bishkaga ela be'elam davar. That generally, meaning when the pasuk is saying that a korban will be brought for accidentally doing Avodah Zarah based on Shigas Maaseh alone, that would only be for people who generally bring a korban chatas for Shigas Maaseh alone, to the exclusion of the kohen Mashiach, because the kohen Mashiach generally would only bring a korban if there was He'elim Dover and Shigas Maaseh, and that would be the same thing by Avodah Zarah as well. The Chum would say that for the kohen Mashiach to bring a korban by Avodah Zarah, it would have to be for Helim Davar in Shigigas Maaseh. V'shamin shebis seira kiyachid, and Rebbe and the Chacham agree that the korban will be a seira, a she-goat, kiyachid, like a individual. Minolan had Minolas the Amar Kol, the pasuk says v'im nefesh achas echad yachid ve'echad nasi ve'echad moshiach kulam b'chal nefesh achas hein, that the pasuk says v'im nefesh achas techta b'shgaga ve'kriva eiz bas shnosa lichatos, and therefore that pasuk of nefesh achas, that right, one soul, any individual soul, whether it is an individual, whether it is a nasi, whether it is a kohen Mashiach, they're all included. And now to finish up, v'shavan shein maybe ashram talui, and Rebbe and the Chacham agree that a kohen Mashiach would not bring a ashram talui. Minal, and how do you know this? Because it says by ashram talui, v'chiper all of our kohen al shigigaso asher shogag. Okay, that the kohen will atone for him for his mistake that he mistaked. Rebbe Sover Misha Kol Cheto Bishgaga. Somebody who all of his sins are Bishigigas Maaseh alone. And yet, according to Rebbe, the only place where a kohen Mashiach would be Bishigigas Maaseh alone would be by Avodah Zarah. Yotze zeh she'ein Kol Cheto Bishgaga ela be'elam davar. Generally speaking, though, Rebbe agrees that by a kohen Mashiach, he would only be chayav to bring a korban when there's he'elim dovrim shigas maaseh. So when the pasuk says by ashram talui v'chipalav a kohen al shigas sheshagag for shigas maaseh alone, Rebbe says that when it comes to kohen Mashiach, shigas maaseh alone is only by avodah zarah. But generally speaking, it would be he'elim dovrim shigas maaseh, and therefore, again, so Rebbe says Misha Kol Cheto Bishgaga, that there's a problem that Hashem Talui is only in scenarios where there's somebody who all of the sins that he's chayav a korban for are for things that are for Shigigas Maaseh. That's simply not the case by a kohen Mashiach, because generally speaking, it's Helim Davarim Shigigas Maaseh. Fighting more Midi Kol Ksiv doesn't say anywhere in the pasuk kol that all of his sins are b'shigas ma'aseh alone. Yes, it effectively does say all of his sins. The pasuk could have just said v'chipar alav kohen al shigigaso. What's the extra asher shogag? Kol cheto b'shgag. It means that all of his sins need to be b'shigas ma'aseh alone, and by a kohen moshiach, only avodah zarah is b'shigas ma'aseh alone, according to Rebbe, and therefore kohen moshiach does not bring Asham Talev Rabbanan, and the rabbis say Misha Cheto Bishgage Yotze Mashiach She'ein Cheto Bishgage Lo Bavadas Kocham Velo Bishar Mitzvahs Ele Belam Dover Mishigas Maise, and the Rabbanan say that a Kohen Mashiach by all of his korbanos it's going to be Elam Dover Mishigas Maise, including Avodah Zarah, and therefore an Asham Tali which is offered for somebody for whom for somebody who brings a korban for Shigas Maise alone, that excludes Kohen Mashiach, who according to the Chachamim brings a korban in all scenarios for Helen Dover in Shigas Maise. Wow. That was Daf Zayin of Masechta Horayos. Alright, that was Daf Zayin of Masechta Horayos. Sheesh. I did not think that this daf was going to take that long, but it looked like it was a pretty long daf. Sheesh. Well, we started the second parak of Masechta Horayos. We started with a little explainer about the Par Kohen Moshiach and the Sa'ir Nasi, that the Sa'ir Nasi is essentially a korban chatos, but for a king. Literally, all the same places that a Yachid would bring a korban chatos, the Nasi brings a Sa'ir Nasi. Just instead of a kispa v'sira, it's a Sa'ir. The Par Kohen Moshiach is only for anointed Kohen Gadol, only for Helim Dover im Shigigas Maise, as we learned throughout the daf, and no korban at all for regular shogeg. So if he thought he was eating chelev, he thought he was eating shuman, it turned out he was eating chelev, Kohen Gadol would not bring any korban at all. Par, or the Kohen Mashiach at least, Par Kohen Mashiach is okay, as we just said, Elam Dover im Shigigas Maise. That kind of came throughout the daf. Then we discussed the relationship between Par Kohen Mashiach and Par Elam Dover Shel Tzibor, that there's no need for a Par Kohen Mashiach for the same mistake as Par Elam Dover Shel Tzibor. So if the Kohen Mashiach and the Sanhedrin had both ruled about Chelev, so the Kohen Mashiach could just rely upon the Par Elam Dover Shel Tzibor. Yes, need for Par Kohen Mashiach when it's a different mistake. So if the Bezdin ruled, the Sanhedrin ruled about Avodah Zarah, for example, and he was ruled for himself about Chelev, so then he would bring his own Par Kohen Mashiach. And when does the Par Kohen Mashiach applies? Well, that was the last Mishnah, which had once again talked about Helen Dover and Shigigas Maise. Sheesh, that was surprisingly long daf. I guess Horayos is a long Masechta. It's only 14 daf, but sheesh, these pages have been big. I hope you enjoyed. Cheers.